Hey guys, what is up? Public here, back with another video, and today we're going to talk about the kind of launch guide for Shadow Priest for Season 1 of The War Within. So this is going to be kind of a preview video of what you can expect to see for Shadow Priest in Season 1, and the reason for that is things are just changing quite rapidly. Even yesterday, Archon got a buff that was about 2% gain in single target, buff, bug fix, that kind of stuff, and I expect we're going to see a couple more of those just come down the pipeline, either with Shadow Priest itself or specific items as well. In this kind of preseason mode when we're in, especially with like early access and that kind of thing, I'm assuming Blizzard is going to be kind of having a bit more free reign to change stuff and tweak stuff, maybe more so than we're used to for an expansion launch. But I didn't want to leave you guys kind of out there hanging out dry, so this video is going to kind of go over everything as it stands right now. And if you want the kind of most up-to-date information, be sure to check out the Icy Veins guide that I'll kind of be going over in this video. This is where I'm going to keep things as up-to-date as I possibly can. And once things become a little bit more stable, kind of probably the launch of the season or maybe the week after, I'll plan to kind of do a more in-depth video series like I've done in the past. So please let me know if there's something specific that you liked in previous guide videos that I've done or that you'd like to see in future ones. Let me know in the comments below. I try to read as much as I can. But without further ado, let's check out where Shadow Priest stands right now. Alright, first thing I want to talk about is hero talents. As a Shadow Priest, you have access to either playing Archon or Voidweaver. Archon is shared with Holy Priest and kind of focuses around Halo and making our cooldowns more empowered. And then Voidweaver, which is shared with Discipline Priest, is focused on this new Entropic Rift that we spawn off of our Void Torrent cast, and then we can kind of extend it, deal some AoE damage, all that kind of thing. Now, with these two hero talent trees, I expect the tuning is still going to kind of be ongoing, which is going to be one of the main kind of hard parts with this, which is why in the guide itself, I've tried my best to give builds for Archon and Voidweaver, so if you'd like to try out one versus the other, you kind of have a starting point for either of those. Now, when it comes to high-end content specifically, so if you're Mythic rating or pushing high keys, right now, Archon is the clear favorite here. Now, this is mostly just because of, one, partly where it's at with the damage pattern. It's still kind of focusing on the big elements of our kit. But most importantly, it's just tuning. Tuning right now heavily favors Archon over Voidweaver. If we look at raids specifically, I did just check, like I mentioned, they did just do a change right now to Archon. Before, the actual Halos that Archon was spawning out, we only get 10 Insanity for that, even though we actually spawned 3 Halos. They've now fixed that, so you get a lot more Insanity for every cast of Halo for Archon. Because of this, Archon is looking about 3 or 4% damage ahead of Voidweaver in kind of pure single target. So from a rating perspective, losing 3 to 4% damage, if you're at a Mythic raid perspective, you're trying to push your character as much as you can. That's just outside of the realm of close enough, in my opinion. If it was only like 1%, maybe even 2%, you can kind of make it work. But as it stands right now, the damage pattern and just where things are, Archon's looking really strong. Now, for certain fight timers, if we think Dark Ascension makes more sense, or in particular, Voidweaver has this really cool ability that is called Devour Matter. If we can ever make use of Devour Matter, which is the thing that actually causes Shadow Death to like deal more damage against shields, it's possible Voidweaver could make up that difference, but I'm worried that in the instances in the raid that we've seen that do have shields, it's not that big of a part of the fight where I think taking the damage loss everywhere else would really make sense. So as it stands right now, Archon's looking like the go-to for raiding. Now, changing gears to Mythic Plus, it's a similar conversation, although the gap has widened quite a bit. The main difference here is what level of key that you're doing. If you're kind of just doing like heroic dungeons, Mythic 0 stuff, or in like the low key range for your group, I think Voidweaver is still going to be pretty competitive. And the reason for that is until you're getting to the point where you're like chain pulling packs, where you're pulling multiple groups of mobs together, or things have a high enough health pool where they're living for like a minute, until then, Voidweaver is still going to do pretty well. And Archon, until you get to that point, might look like it's struggling a little bit, primarily because Archon strongly prefers to play with Void Eruption. And inside of Mythic Plus, Void Eruption kind of struggles until you hit that point where either you're pulling enough mobs to make up for it, or the pack's living long enough to where you're not like ending a pack and you still have like 20 seconds left of Void Form. So if you're in that spot where it's like, hey, I want to try out, see if my key level is right for Archon, well, if you're doing this kind of massive big first pull and you kill everything and you still have cooldowns running, okay, Archon's probably going to struggle a little bit there. So similar to what we had in Dragonflight, where early low keys, that Dark Ascension playstyle is nice. And because Void Weaver prefers to play with Dark Ascension, meaning in terms of sims and that kind of thing, it does more damage with Dark Ascension. That's the kind of cutoff point for those keys. So if you're in a low key environment, absolutely try out Void Weaver. I think it'll be a fun thing to play. You can definitely try out Archon in that environment too. But once you get into the kind of higher key environments, that's where Archon's really going to shine. You're going to see 10, 15, 20% gains on top of Void Weaver in that kind of mass AoE environment. All right, now for Archon and Void Weaver, I'll just kind of go over the specific hero talent trees real quick if you haven't seen this. These don't change that much from build to build, so this is why I kind of wanted to bring it up. When it comes to like a rating perspective as Archon, we do have a couple things that you could consider changing, but not nearly as much as Void Weaver. Of course, the only thing that you can change is these choice nodes here. From like a rating perspective, the only real choice here is going to be sustained potency. This is what we prefer to play inside of a rating environment because it gives us that longer duration of our cooldowns. The other two, pretty much personal preference, kind of utility choice options. In a rating environment, you're always going to want Word of Supremacy, though. Almost always. I can't really think of a case where you wouldn't. This choice in Incessant Screams doesn't really matter. Totally up to you on that. Now, if we swap over to Mythic Plus, I would suggest playing with Energy Compression instead, which gives you increased damage on Halo itself. You could play Sustained Potency if the key is like a high enough level to maybe get some value out of that. But from what I've seen, packs usually aren't living quite that long to where you don't get that much value out of Sustained Potency. But if you're hitting that point where you still have some room for your cooldowns, you could consider rolling with Sustained Potency even in keys as well. Now, switching over to Void Weaver, we have a bit more options here, specifically from like a utility or non-throughput choice. You can choose between Void Leech or Embrace the Shadow. Void Leech is like the safe default because it'll just work for the most part all the time, unless you're doing solo content, at which you should pick Embrace the Shadow. The kind of big difference here from like if you look like a raid or a dungeon is if most of the damage taken is physical or non-magic, that's where I would lean to take Void Leech. If, however, most of the damage, which is pretty common these days, is magic damage, and especially if that damage is Shadow, I would 100% suggest to pick Embrace the Shadow as well. So in raiding, a lot of the fights are going to get more use out of Embrace the Shadow compared to Void Leech, but there are a couple notable encounters in the raid that just don't really do any magic damage to you, specifically the Priest, which Void Leech will make more sense. Kind of swap these around depending on what makes sense for you. Now, similar with the utility choice, you can play Dark Energy, which gives you the Void Torrent cast while casting. This is kind of the safe default for me, especially inside of raiding. And then from like a damage throughput perspective, right now Void Empowerment looks to be the choice all the time. I don't really see a point where Darkening Horizon really makes sense for the current way that this is tuned, although it is close in single target. And then as far as Void Wraith and Depth of Shadows goes, while in AoE environments, they can be kind of even or leaning towards Depth of Shadows being better, single target almost always favors Void Wraith, especially when you're looking at overall damage done in a pull. If you specifically kind of zone in on, hey, I want to do more damage in execute, the fight, you really don't start leaning towards Depth of Shadows until you hit like 20% or 15%, and that's when Depth of Shadows really kind of pops off in terms of like strength of the fight. Because you get just more procs of Depth of Shadows. The target's naturally below 20% health. So if you want to optimize for just 20% health and below that, you can get better value out of Depth of Shadows. But if you're purely trying to do overall damages, Void Weaver, Void Wraith is the kind of go-to there if you decide you want to play Void Weaver inside of raiding. Now, for Mythic Plus, Void Weaver gets a couple different things. Like I mentioned, you can play Depth of Shadows as kind of the default choice here. I think it's kind of fun to like snipe enemies that are low health to get these kind of procs. You can, of course, still play Void Wraith if you want more single target damage, but of course, that's up to you. I would also note that there is kind of more of an option here to run No Escape if you're interested in that kind of slow portion of Entropic Rift. Just be a little careful, as like sometimes slowing mobs can really kind of mess with what the tank is trying to do. So make sure you coordinate with your group like, hey, does the slow for Rift help with this key or not? Otherwise, I would just play Dark Energy. So that's kind of our hero talents in a nutshell when it comes to the build perspective. Let's dive into how these hero talents actually change your rotation. All right, so from a rotation perspective, largely if you played Shadow Priest in like season 3 or 4 of Dragonflight, it's going to be quite similar to what it's like in the War Within. The key difference here comes in the form of basically our hero talents more than anything. So I'll kind of go over the differences in the rotation just kind of as a condensed version, so you can kind of know like, hey, if you're playing Archon, this is what you would expect. If you're playing Void Weaver, this is what you do instead. So starting with Archon, the first change that we'll talk about is Halo. So of course, Halo now becomes a rotational ability that you need to press in the exact spot with your cooldowns. Because it is a 1 minute cooldown and it has a cast associated with it, it will do some desyncing in the rotation, which is normal, especially because we're pressing it 2 times every 2 minutes compared to Void Eruption, which is just once every 2 minutes. Because of this desync, what this looks like as far as when you cast it in the rotation, in the actual opener itself, you'll do Vampiric Touch into Shadow Fiend, Double Mind Blast, then you Halo right before Void Eruption. That's the kind of normal sequence for your opener. And then every Halo after that, you basically just want to slam it on cooldown. And what that will look like is, on your second cast of Void Eruption, which would be your third Halo of the fight, the cooldowns will be a little off, and you notice that you'd actually have to hold Void Eruption in order to Halo before. So with that, to kind of make that make sense, we say that subsequent casts of Halo, when you have Void Eruption available, will actually happen inside of Void form, and that's totally okay. So after you press your Void Eruption the second time, you'll Halo a couple globals after, totally okay. The other thing with Halo is just to kind of be aware of your positioning, and as just Archon in general. Halo does have a 40-yard range as Archon, or if you have Psychic Reach talented or Phantom Reach talented, it will get increased as well. However, it's a couple yards short of what it says in the tooltip. So at max range, it'll say like 46 yards or something if you have all the talents and everything. In reality, it's only about 44 yards, 43 yards, and it does have a dead zone right by your character. So when it's actually coming out from you, you'll notice it'll stop a couple yards short of 46. And then when it comes back in, it kind of fizzles right before it hits your character. And this can cause it to miss hits depending on your positioning. So the thing you got to keep in mind, just be aware of this. You want to kind of stay within that green zone of like 10 to 40 yards, give or take. That's like the sweet spot where you want all the mobs to be in. As long as they're not super close to you or super far away from you, you'll be fine, but it's just something to keep in mind. And the last kind of rotational change with Archon is you're going to get more Mind Flay and Sanity procs. So just be aware of that and kind of know how those fit in the rotation. You really only slam Mind Flay and Sanity at like top high priority when you have 3 or 4 stacks of the Surge of Insanity buff. And that's just because we have so many other things we can press. If you're not about to cap on stacks or you're at risk of losing a stack, you don't need to kind of slam it at the highest priority. You can kind of afford to, hey, I'm going to weave in some Mind Blast, press Void Bolt or Void Torrent, whatever else it is. And the exact like where you press all of those abilities doesn't matter a whole lot. Just try to slam things on cooldown as much as you can and avoid overcapping things like Surge of Insanity. And that's more or less all there is to Archon. Okay, moving on to Void Weaver. Void Weaver has a couple more changes to it that I want to highlight. The first one is with Shadow or Death, which is probably not where you expected me to start, but because of the Devour Matter talent that I mentioned earlier, one of the key things that you want to pay attention to is if your target has an Absorb Shield active. If you're using my weak cores that I have linked down below, or like Plater does this by default pretty well, it will track when the target has an Absorb active, and when that's true, you basically want to slam Shadow or Death at more or less the highest priority in your kit. Now, the reason why you want to slam it at the highest priority is just to get that extra damage increase from Devour Matter. Currently, Insanity is seemingly a little bit bugged, but hopefully this gets fixed soon. It's kind of be a key rotation for Void Weaver. Now, the next kind of most important thing with Void Weaver is keeping mind of your Void Torrent cooldown. Void Torrent, of course, is what actually spawns in Tropic Rift. And one of the key questions that I get asked quite a lot is, should I be like clipping my Void Torrent? One thing that's not extra clear in the talent tree, if you weren't aware, well, yes, Void Torrent spawns in Tropic Rift at the start of Void Torrent. When the cast of Void Torrent actually ends, it refreshes the duration of Entropic Rift based on how long you spent channeling Void Torrent. So if you channel Void Torrent for the full 3 seconds, it refreshes Entropic Rift 3 seconds. What that means is there is no incentive to ever cancel your Void Torrent early, especially because you can now cast while moving in if you're taking Dark Energy. So be sure to always aim to full channel your Void Torrent. The reason why we do that and kind of where we put it in our rotation alongside that, we always want a Devouring Plague right before this. So we Devouring Plague, then we Void Torrent, and then we should have a window to hit Void Blast and kind of go on with the rotation as needed from there. And similar to kind of where we were at cooldown wise with Archon and Halo, you will also want to be conscious of the cooldowns with Void Torrent. So Void Torrent, we're always going to take Malediction inside of the spec tree with Void Weaver, and the reason we do that is to lower the cooldown of Void Torrent. So that means you can press Void Torrent every 30 seconds. You typically run Dark Ascension with Void Weaver because of the synergy, not only with that spell, but also the Inescapable Torment spells and kind of where that fits in the talent tree. And Dark Ascension just does more damage as Void Weaver. The reason why I bring that up is because it's a 30-second cooldown, Dark Ascension is a minute cooldown. You want to be really conscious of where your cooldowns are at and making sure that you're not losing uses of those cooldowns. And what that means is Void Eruption is the most sensitive. If you delay Void Torrent by even a couple seconds, it's going to put you in kind of this awkward position where, well, you don't want to use it 10 seconds late, because then when you have Dark Ascension back up, you have to press Dark Ascension late. And if that's one of the windows where you had Power Infusion available, now you have to delay Power Infusion, and it can be kind of a mess syncing all of those cooldowns together. So the best thing that you can try to do as best as you can is to slam these things on cooldown. Void Torrent, Dark Ascension, especially so when they're kind of like off cooldown windows. While you get PI every other Dark Ascension, so that other one you want to be really rigid about pressing it on cooldown should the fight be lasting that long. Obviously, there are cases where, well, if the pack has one mob left that has 5% health, yeah, of course, like, don't press an ability there. You just want to be conscious of those cooldowns when you're playing Void Weaver to make sure you're taking the most advantage of those cooldowns being buffed as much as you can. The other big kind of rotational change, while the Rift is active, you do kind of want to slam your Void Blasts. You'll kind of get into a feel with this, though, where you know that you're only ever going to get like 2 to 3 of these, more or less, per window. If you were taking Darkening Horizon, you could sometimes squeeze in an extra one, obviously kind of depending on Shadowy Insight procs. And the way that you can kind of make that consistent is by pooling Mind Blast charges. I've done a video on this in the past. I will let you know that it is less significant now than it was before. So if one of the things that was putting you off from Void Weaver was this pooling thing, I'll tell you this right now. You could basically not play with this at all, and the damage you deal will be almost identical. The way that Sims are currently pooling Mind Blast, if you just have Mind Flay in the build, which is default right now for all Void Weaver stuff, you only want to make sure that you're not pressing Mind Blast right before Void Torrent ever. As long as you do that, you're fine. Just don't do anything else too crazy. If you are playing Mind Spike, there is a bit more of incentive to do like 3 or 4 GCDs before Void Torrent. Make sure you don't press Mind Blast. Otherwise, it's going to play pretty much exactly the same as the rest of the spec. Just make sure to press your stuff on cooldown as much as possible. All right, so from a rotation perspective, I know that was kind of brief. I kind of only did the highlights. If you want the full thing, what I would suggest to look at is the Icy Veins rotation guide. Down here, I have a bunch of example build configurations of like, okay, here's Archon single target, standard key, push key, kind of that stuff with Archon. You can select Void Weaver, get all your Void Weaver stuff. And what those buttons do is actually change the various rotations that I show on this page. So if you want to see like the opener, for example, well, if you want the opener for Void Weaver single target build, this is the opener for the Void Weaver single target build. So it kind of shows you all the examples there up until your first Void Torrent. And then, of course, you have the full priority list if you're kind of interested in knowing, okay, where do I put spells, where, at what priority level. Everything is going to be here. I don't want to go over this into too much specific in-depth just because this very well might change over the couple days if they're doing any kind of tuning or things like that. So make sure you're watching out for that as we move forward. All right, let's talk about talent builds. I'm only going to kind of show you briefly what these trees look like. If you want kind of the full explanation, the Icy Veins guide gives you kind of a good starting point for that. So first things first, let's talk about rating builds. I'll go over builds for both Archon and Void Weaver here, although, again, like I mentioned, Archon is about 3 to 4% better than Void Weaver right now in terms of raid performance. I would strongly suggest starting out with Archon in your play. If you're dead set on playing Void Weaver, though, I'll give you those trees as well. So for Archon and single target, this is kind of what this looks like. We only play Idol of Cthulhu, and then we just kind of slam a bunch of stuff in this middle row here. Unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot of play around apparitions in terms of its damage and single target, so Yogg-Saron doesn't make sense for this build. N'Zoth is very AoE, and Archon really doesn't have anything that synergizes well with Mindbender, Yashiraj, so we kind of just slam these points in the middle of the tree and just go nuts with these kind of things. A lot of 2-pointers in the kind of middle section there with the build. And then, of course, Archon and Void Weaver both, you only need 2 builds for raiding. So 2 Archon builds or 2 Void Weaver builds for every single raid fight, these 2 builds. This is the base one for pure single target. So if the fight doesn't have any kind of adds or anything, this is the build that you're going to want to run. Now, if the fight, and again, this is the same thing we talked about earlier, we take sustained potency, it's a rated thing, all that good stuff. Now, if the fight does have adds, we shift the tree over and add Shadow Crash and Whispering Shadows. I usually prefer Right Crash just because it's more controllable, but you can pick whichever one you really want. Depends on the fight and kind of when that would be a problem. Now, you do notice that we do end up picking Mindbender here, and that's simply just because it's point efficient to get there. Now that we can actually path through it, we're never going to take Maddening Touch on single target if we can avoid it. But Mindbender is just nice from an Insanity generation perspective. Gets you more Surge of Insanity casts in your kind of burst there, which makes it kind of the go-to pick now that Shadow Crash lets us path into it. Now, you can kind of move some points if you're on it you want, but this is kind of the usual base build here. We're just kind of trading a couple points here and there because of how convenient it is to then swap over here. Otherwise, the big chunk of the build stays the same. And again, you're still talking about single target damage. We're still going to prefer running sustained potency. So those are your kind of Archon builds for raiding. Now, if we swap over to Void Weaver, like I mentioned in the past, does better damage with Dark Ascension. So we're going to prefer to pick that here. Now with this, there's a synergy that we talked about of playing Dark Ascension, Mindbender, and Inescapable Torment. You have Void Torment on a 30-second window. It kind of all plays together. And with that, we're going to play Void Wraith. You get a lot that kind of reverse execute damage thing going on, and that's kind of the full course of the build. The main standout difference, in addition to now having to play around Inescapable Torment, which is the kind of Shadow Word Death and Mind Blast while Bender is active, is that we also prefer to play with Distorted Reality as Void Weaver in single target. You see, most builds this season are going to want to play with Mind's Eye because of the synergy with our tier set, but Void Weaver in particular, you'll notice that it's going to struggle with timing and having enough Devouring Plague uptime to do what you want to do in your side of your burst. Specifically, if you press Devouring Plague, then you press Void Torrent, if you have Mind's Eye, especially without the tier set, you're going to be really rushed to get that first Void Blast off before Devouring Plague falls off. So because of that, you see a lot of strong synergies with Void Weaver wanting to play Destroyed Reality when it comes to single target. You can play Mind's Eye if you want. It's pretty close, but we do see the lean towards Destroyed Reality here. And if we swap to its single target Shadow Crash build, you can see we basically just trade the points from Maddening Touch to go Shadow Crash as well. It's a little bit more point efficient for Void Weaver to pick this up than his Archon, but realistically it's not that much different. The rest of the build stays the same. You still play Void Empowerment and Void Wraith. So those are builds for single target and raiding. All right, let's talk about builds for Dungeons, AoE, and Mythic Plus. So before the raids come out, these are going to be the builds that we're going to get the most use out of, particularly if you're just kind of doing preseason content. So I'm going to show you the 2 builds that I'll suggest for that kind of space where packs are not going to be really living that long. Dungeons are going to be pretty quick. Packs aren't living for a minute, that kind of thing. And because of that, our builds can afford to be a bit more snappier, and we're not as concerned with like large sustained AoE damage. So in this environment, you can actually feel free to play Archon or Void Weaver. They should be pretty close in comparison when looking at these kind of fights. Although again, it's kind of preference here, so play what you think is more fun. I'll show you the Archon build up first. The actual Archon tree looks pretty similar. We just prefer to take energy compression inside of that AoE Mythic Plus environment. And the tree itself looks pretty similar to what we do inside of a raiding environment. We just move a couple points around to kind of full in on Idol of N'Zoth, Screams of the Void, and we don't need that point in Malediction because we're not as concerned with it if we're not on single target. Otherwise, the build will play pretty similar to kind of what you saw before, kind of like with the single target crash scenario. Now, if you want to play Void Weaver instead, again, very, very similar build. The points are very similar. We just have to play Malediction. Otherwise, things are almost identical. Both of the builds prefer to play with Mind's Eye for the kind of increased priority target damage. I know in the previous stuff I mentioned that Void Weaver likes Destroyed Reality on single target, but because of the kind of increase in priority target damage and how it does its funneling, it just prefers to play Mind's Eye. If you want to play Destroyed Reality here instead, you absolutely can. Definitely a viable choice, but I would still strongly say do that kind of priority target damage style by only using Devouring Plagues on the main target of the pack. Just more efficient cleave for the rest of the group. Now, for the hero talents for Void Weaver, like we mentioned before, we're always going to play Void Empowerment, and then I would suggest starting with Depths of Shadows. But if you want more single target, if you want more boss damage, feel free to play Void Weaver here instead. And then you can obviously play whatever you want in the kind of utility tree section. So there is a third build, and I'm only mentioning this because I think if you're watching any footage on beta or things like that, you're probably wondering where this build is at. Archon has an optional build that I think I only want to put out there as the kind of max AoE damage or like full high key pushing variant. Just because this is dropping quite a bit of single target to pick up Yogg Saron in particular. We can't run Insidious IR, we can't run Mastermind. Those points are really nice in terms of single target damage, but don't do quite as much in AoE for Archon. But this is our top AoE damage build. You be my guest if you want to play this in kind of the content we're in now, but I think you'll get better overall damage with the other two builds as it stands right now. But if you kind of want to play this build and see how it plays and how it feels, this will probably be what a lot of high key pushers will play, or some variant of this kind of triple idol setup with N'Zoth, Yogg Saron, and Cthulhu. So feel free to try this out as well. Links for all of the builds that I've gone over are in the Icy Veins guide, so check that out below. All right, so I've already covered quite a lot in this video. I don't want to go too crazy long in it, but I will kind of highlight some big points in terms of gearing and kind of enchants and that kind of thing. So starting up with secondary stats, largely the same. It's still intellect over haste mastery, generally speaking. And I did put some updated goals here of kind of when you're first gearing out your Shadow Priest, what you should be looking for. I will say generally what we're seeing in kind of early stats and that kind of thing right now is that haste is kind of becoming a little less important for us, particularly when it comes to single target. So what that means is once you get around that like 15% haste, which is just makes the spec actually feel better to play. Once you get 15% haste, you can kind of pause on stacking haste and making sure you get your mastery up into a good threshold, like 15-18% would be great. Make sure you don't totally ignore critical strike, but it's much less important. And so we kind of lean into mastery over haste on single target when we're kind of dumping stats. And then in AoE specifically, we kind of go back towards haste over mastery. Now, that's only really true if you're doing more stuff with like shadowy apparitions and Yogg Saron builds and like high keys where we really start to see haste take over. But even the kind of like lower keys or Void Weaver in particular, you'll still see mastery be really strong in keys, if not even to haste, even sometimes leaning that way. So again, haste mastery is still our top two stats. So if you're like crafting any gear, that kind of thing, or if you're looking for drops, haste and mastery is the way to go. Speaking of drops, on the gear page inside of Icy Veins, I have a ton of resources here for you to check out. There's a lot of lists of gear. They're called best in slot, but take that with a pretty heavy grain of salt, sorry. There are so many good gear pieces to build and kind of make a good set of gear as a Shadow Priest. These are just some examples that you can use. But if you're looking for some pieces to like target of like, hey, I need a really good neck, where's a great neck in preseason specifically, this is for just preseason, you can go to this list and see what is available. Now, of course, there are some dungeons available in preseason like Dark Flame Cleft or Cinder Meadery. These are not going to be involved in Season 1. So when Season 1 comes out, I also have a couple lists for that as well. The overall one, this one combines crafting with raid gear and Mythic Plus gear to kind of give you an example setup of what a really good set of gear looks like. There's also one of, if you don't want to get any raid gear whatsoever, this is a list of drops only from Mythic Plus that you can kind of use to help target like, hey, I really need a good waste. Where's the best like farmable waste inside of Mythic Plus? Oh, it's Court of the Pious Warder out of Siege of Borellis. So this list should hopefully be helpful. I tried to list alternates where they made sense and a lot of stuff with like the catalyst and that kind of thing as well. And there's one for raiding as well. If you want like, okay, where are the best boots that drop inside of raid? Oh, it's these eggshell slippers off of Bruce Twister Almanac. So hopefully this is a good resource for you to kind of help target gear. In addition, this page has all kinds of good stuff. It also has a tier list of trinkets, at least how they work out right now. Again, like I mentioned, they're doing kind of a lot of tuning here, so expect to see the most changes in the trinket section. Might be moving some of these stuff around. I don't think our kind of top A tier trinkets will really be changing, but you could expect to see some of these D tier or C tier trinkets move up a section if the balancing works out as we expect. There's a list for rating, Mythic Plus focused, also get a highlight of good time walking trinkets, and then also kind of the trinkets explained section. Not only does this link you to the trinket charts, so if you didn't know, if we click on the second link for Archon, we have sim charts for all kinds of stuff. This one is particularly for trinkets. So if you kind of want to see what like a rough idea of trinkets at like what eye level is stacking up against each other, this is a good kind of starting resource. Of course, you want to sim your character as much as you can, but if you want kind of an idea of where trinkets fall in the kind of grand scheme of things, this is a good resource to check out. And it has sims for all kinds of stuff that you could ever want as a Shadow Priest. So if you haven't checked this out, the link for that will also be down below. This also kind of goes over and explains some trinkets, a bit of like tech of how to use some of them as well. And then down here, I'll kind of also highlight the crafted gear section. So with crafted gear, things are still very much in flux, so take this section with a big grain of salt. But this is how things are shaping up right now in terms of crafting as a Shadow Priest. I don't want to go into too much depth because I think this might change, but what we're seeing right now is we're kind of leaning towards crafting binding of binding first. If you can find a friend to craft this with and trade the buffs with each other, this is going to look to be a pretty strong first craft for us. If you don't have that friend or won't know if you'll have access to that, what we're really going to do is be stacking Dusk Thread Lining. This is the blue silken lining version, this expansion, for versatility. There is also one that is critical strike, but they're so close together and even that I would suggest running Dusk Thread over Dawn Thread simply to get that extra defensive value. Now, if you're looking to craft something super early and you're not quite sure when you're going to get a myth track weapon, you can craft just like a one-hitted weapon with Blessed Weapon Grip on it. And that's just because you can't put Dusk Thread Lining on a weapon. So you can do this first step if you're trying to get that weapon item level increased right away really fast. Just know that this will eventually be replaced once you get your hands on a myth track weapon. The other kind of awkward part with this strategy is that there's really only one good offhand inside of Season 1 right now, which is the Pale of Preserved Obscurity. I believe this is from City of Threads, if my memory is correct. Yep, on City of Threads. So this is like the only haste mastery offhand really that we have access to in Season 1. So that's the kind of awkward part with that strategy, but just know that's there if you want. Advice for Mythic Plus is the same as well. So like I mentioned, I expect some things to change at some point, but that's how things are looking right now when it comes to gearing. Okay, let's talk about enchants and gems. So starting off with gems real quick, they have changed up what you're going to want to do. It's a little different than previous seasons. You want to focus on getting your Culminating Blasphemite as soon as you can. This will go in your first socket. This is actually giving us primary stat and a critical effect per unique gem color. So this means you don't just want to stack one gem color for everything. You actually do want to use one of each color besides amber. We'll get to that in a second. Now, the way you actually apply sockets, you can actually buy an item or get a jewel crafter to make it that adds a socket to a neck or ring item. And each of those can have 2 sockets. So that means you get 2 sockets on your neck, 2 on your first ring, and 2 on your second ring. So without doing anything with the Great Vault, that's 6 sockets you can have all the time. So it's a lot easier to get those first 6 sockets. And then if you want sockets on your helm, wrists, or waist, you can get the Nerubian Gemweaver from the Great Vault, kind of bad luck protection or whatever you want to say. So those last 3 sockets will be a little bit harder to come by. You just have to wait until you get a bad vault, basically. But otherwise, you should have 6 sockets to kind of work on early on. Now, with those first 6, I kind of give you a rough idea of where to put things. It's pretty simple. We want to kind of layer things around based on the color, focusing on the ones that we like the most, and then go to the ones we like the least. Generally speaking, based on the stats discussion I mentioned earlier in the video, you want to prioritize haste and mastery for your sockets and your stats here. You want to lean towards haste first if you're below 15% haste. If you're at or above 15% haste, you want to go mastery on the gems here. So for the most part, a lot of that 50% haste should be relatively easy to hit. So a lot of people are going to use mastery focused gems. And this is kind of the example progression there. Your first socket, we'll do the Culminating Blasphemite. Then we'll go Masterful Emerald, which is haste heavy into mastery. Then we go Quick Onyx, which is mastery into haste. The Masterful Ruby, which is critical strike and mastery. Masterful Sapphire, which is verse and mastery. So that'll complete our colors that we care about. And then you just stack Masterful Emerald or Quick Onyx, depending on where your stats are right now. Like I mentioned, there are Amber Gems, which are main stamina. As of right now, these are not worth it to use for us. It just doesn't make sense to drop that. Even from a defensive benefit, it's still kind of out of the realm of margin, but you know, if you really want the stamina, I guess it's there as an option. Just doesn't scale it that much. And then for enchants, this is all pretty straightforward. There's not a whole lot changing here, but just to go over these real quick. Okay, for your chest, you want Crystalline Radiance. For your cloak, you can either pick Chant of Winged Grace or Chant of Leeching Fangs if you want Avoidance or Leech. Personally, I would prefer you default to Avoidance stuff, but you pick whatever you think makes sense for you. Bracer, same thing. You have Chant of Armored Avoidance or Armored Leech. For our leg enchant, spell thread rather, you're always going to want to use Sunset Spell Thread, which gives you intellect and stamina. The other one increases the mana pool instead of stamina, which we just don't get any value of, so make sure you always use this one. For ring enchants, keep in mind that kind of 15% haste like ish goal. Again, if you're below that, use haste enchants on your ring. If you're at or above that, you probably want to use mastery enchants, but you can always sim this if you're curious. For your boot enchants, this is non-throughput. It's just kind of, you know, speed basically. So you can just use the one that's flat stamina if you want the extra defensive, but personally, I'm a bigger advocate for running Scout's March here to get the extra speed, but pick whatever you think makes the most sense for you. And then for your weapon, you're going to want Authority of the Depths as your main weapon enchant. It's just a stacking shadow dot. Seems to proc pretty well. This is just our best choice right now. As far as other consumables go, so you want Flask of Alchemical Chaos is going to be your kind of default here. You can run the ones that are just Mastery, Haste, or even Verse if you want the kind of defensive value. These are just slightly worse, but depending on your stats, this could help fix your stats or make things more consistent. So that is there as an option if you'd like. And then for potion, we always use the Tempered Potion. And then as far as food for Shadow, this like value-wise is like cratered since Dragonflight. You can kind of use whatever you want. If the feast is available, go ahead and use that. If you want to make it yourself, the Chippy Tea is our kind of default one here. And then make sure you have your kind of weapon rune as well for Shadow, which is Algari Mana Oil. And if you really want to go all out, yeah, there's the new Augment rune as well. Okay, last but not least, I do have some macros as well for your Shadow Priest. If you're just new to the spec, I would suggest going through this macros and add-on page. I kind of link all of the macros that I've used or had people use in the past, as well as a whole section on the add-ons that I would suggest as well. I have an older video where I kind of walk through how I use some of those, but if you're curious with how any of these work out, feel free to check this out. Let me know if you have any other questions on that, but that is all we have for this guide. I know this has been super long, and I didn't go into as much detail as I wanted to. Like I said, if you want the kind of most up-to-date stuff, please check out the Icy Veins guide. I'll keep it as up-to-date as I can. Enjoy the launch of Season 1. I don't know how much videos I'll put out between now and the kind of official start of the season. And then when things settle down, hopefully you'll see me back again with more videos. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.